Just bring this up here. Hello, everyone. I'm John Opdyke. I'm the president of Open Primaries. I want to welcome everybody to today's Zoom call. We're doing one of these a week now. We've had some great conversations over the last month and a half, and I'm really excited and pleased to welcome Reverend Darryl Gray, Aaron Hamlin, and Benjamin Singer from the St. Louis Approves campaign, three important spokespeople for the effort to our discussion today. By way of introduction, Aaron is the executive director of the Center for Election Science, which is a national, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that studies and advances better voting methods. Ben is the communications director for St. Louis Treasurer Tashora Jones, and also a member of the steering committee of the St. Louis Approves campaign, Proposition D for democracy, as we call it. Reverend Gray is a veteran civil rights leader and political activist with more than 35 years experience working to break down barriers to participation and community empowerment. And I'm really pleased to welcome all three of you here. Welcome.
Thank you.
All right, so let's jump right into it. Could you give us, maybe Ben, you could take point on this, a quick overview of the St. Louis Approves campaign, the basics. What does it do? What's the history behind it? How did it come together? Give us the elevator pitch for the St. Louis Approves campaign.
Will do, absolutely. Thank you, John, and thank you to Open Primaries for all your support of this critical effort to ensure that we actually have a government of by and for the people in St. Louis and across the country. And it's great to see so many leaders here who've been helping and standing up for this movement, including Jesse Fields and David Carey. And thank you to Reverend Gray for being on this call and for his community leadership on this important democracy issue as well, and voting rights issue. So the reason that we're launching this campaign is a history of failed anti-democratic election outcomes due to our closed primary system and our single winner voting system. So we have, what is usually known as the worst possible system of elections here in St. Louis, which is party primaries with plurality winners. So even if you get less than 50%, in some cases people are getting 25, 30% of the vote in that Democratic primary, and then they go on to the general election, which is meaningless because in St. Louis the Democratic nomination means everything here.
Right.
And so there were a couple really high profile examples of this most recently in the mayor's race in 2017, where four viable African-American candidates all split the vote, and the one viable white candidate won with 32% of the vote. So we have a mayor who got 32% of the vote in the Democratic primary, which equates to about 5% of the residents of St. Louis who actually voted for that candidate. And then in the president of the Board of Aldermen race, which is basically like the president of our city council, who also has some other powers in the city government, won with 35.6% of the vote. So that first one was in 2017 and the second one was in 2019. So, by consulting with election experts across the country and locally, and election administrators and community leaders, it was very clear to us that the way to move forward was a nonpartisan open primary system where you could vote for as many candidates as you like, which is called approval voting, which I'm sure we'll delve into briefly in a little bit, which is advocated for by the Center for Election Science, and we're really grateful for their support. And so anyway, open primary, nonpartisan, voters can pick as many candidates as they like, and then the top two go to a runoff election. And it's actually my understanding from one of our board members that a political scientist who was on one of these open primaries calls happened to mention that that kind of system might actually be an ideal type of system for local elections. So that was really exciting to hear. And just to be clear also, I'm not here in my capacity with the government position. I'm here in my capacity with the steering committee of St. Louis Approves and as a board member of Show Me Integrity, which is Missouri's statewide cross-partisan good government organization. So
Got
thank you
it.
again.
And I want to talk about that later in the call. Yes, so let's pivot. Aaron, give us a description of approval voting. I want to make sure everyone's familiar with it, how it works.
Sure. With approval voting, it contrasts only slightly, but in a very meaningful way from the way that we normally vote. When we normally vote, we're forced to choose just one candidate. Even if there are a bunch of candidates on the ballot, you only choose one. But with approval voting, you have that vote for one restriction removed. And so now when you see this candidate list, if you like more than one candidate, you can vote for more than one candidate. You can vote for as many candidates as you want, and it's still the candidate with the most votes wins. In the context of the St. Louis ballot initiative, we're integrating this with a nonpartisan open primary, and then having the top two go into the general election. So in this context, during the nonpartisan open primary, regardless of your political affiliation, you have all the candidates in front of you, and you can pick as many of those candidates as you want. And then the top two of those candidates go on to the general election, and then you have the general election between those two candidates.
Got it. And approval voting, you enacted it up in North Dakota. Is it anywhere else in the country at this point? Are people using it?
So we've demonstrated the proof of concept within Fargo, North Dakota. It's been used with a number of organizations. Prior to that, the upcoming election next month will be the first use of approval voting in government elections. That one technically is a multi-winner election. It's a two-seat commissioner race. And then the next time in Fargo that it's used, it will be used for the mayoral election, which is obviously a single winner election.
Great. All right, I want to bring Reverend Gray in here. I have somewhat of a long-winded question here. I'm actually reading a book that just came out last week about St. Louis. It's called The Broken Heart of America, and it's a really unflinching look at how St. Louis was systematically segregated over the last 150 years. But it also looks at how Black and white St. Louis citizens have come together in some pretty innovative ways to take on the status quo. I don't know if you knew this, for example, but the sit-in tactic, which became so nationally pronounced in Greensboro, North Carolina, was actually used in St. Louis in the early 50s. So my question is this: how do you think, and all of you, how do you think about advancing a campaign for voter empowerment in a city where those issues have a long and troubled history? I mean, every time people have come together to advance structural change, positive change in St. Louis, the reaction has been fierce and severe. So how do you think about building this campaign in St. Louis, given its history?
I think, and first of all, thank you for having me on, John, and thanks for everybody that's on the call and that's interested. Ben is doing an awesome job here in organizing and educating and getting people involved to help them to understand that open primaries does benefit us. We are a very Democratic Party-led city. And as I was saying earlier this week, St. Louis is a northern city that faces south. So when we talk about the reality of segregation, and we talk about the way in which politics are run in St. Louis, we talk about silo politics or segregated politics, because we're still looking at 28 wards, and they are basically segregated wards, the north and the south. The Delmar divide is real. Delmar is a street that runs east and west. The southern side of Delmar, which is the side of the city that the current mayor basically represents, is predominantly white. The northern part of the city is predominantly Black. And so we continue to see this, what I call this silo politics or segregated politics, play out in St. Louis. And it's because we don't have that open primary system. I think that, it's not the end all be all, but definitely it would contribute more to the of the people, by the people, democracy philosophy. What we have seen in this city in our silo politics. And I think Ben mentioned it, two races, recent races, one for mayor, one for president of the city council, where both candidates received less than. In one case, it was less than 35%. In another case, it's less than 40%. And so what the winner tends to do in these races, you feed the horse that brought you across the line, which means that you continue to focus on one particular section of the community, the political community that brings you across. And so in the mayor's race, you had 6 or 7 candidates, 1 white, 5 black. Now, I want to be very clear. This does not mean that white candidates cannot represent black communities, and it doesn't mean that black candidates cannot represent white communities. That's not what we're saying. Right. But what we are saying is that without open primaries, you do not force candidates to collaborate. You do not force elected officials to build coalitions, to build alliances, to build bridges. And you ultimately end up, as we are seeing in St. Louis in particular, issues don't become priorities with losing communities. That's what we're finding. And so you still see in St. Louis, which has I would say, majority black community, St. Louis is still #1 in black murders. It's still #1 in black on black crime. It's still #1 on violent crime. It's still #1 on infant mortality rate among African Americans. It's still #1 in all the bad categories, even though it's a majority black city. And so what I believe is that open primaries can contribute to creating a dialogue and a collaboration that may cause the winners to begin to look at a number of issues that benefit the whole city versus a candidate, the winner, only looking at the issues that benefit the people or the group that elected them.
Got it.
And you give long questions, so I give long answers.
No, I like that. That's good. That's very clear. Thank you. I have a couple more questions, and then I want to open it up for everybody on the call. Just a quick, the way we're going to do the Q&A is that if you have a question, go into the chat feature, type your name and your state, and then a 1-sentence summary of what you want to ask. You don't have to type out your whole question, just a summary. It helps me kind of think of how to, because if 4 people have the exact same question, I'm not going to call on all 4. So again, go into the chat, your name, your state, 1-sentence summary, and then we'll open it up. But I have a couple more questions before that. So this is for Aaron, Ben, and Reverend Gray, the 3 of you. What's been the experience of talking with St. Louis residents? And you guys have gone out and you got more than 10,000 signatures in one day this year. Clearly, you're out there organizing and talking to people about combining these 2 reforms. I think it's very innovative and very interesting. How are people responding to you when you're talking about, hey, let's do a new way of voting, approval voting, and let's do open primaries, which 85% of the cities already have? What's the community response been?
I think for me, as I talk primarily to the black community, I ask people, nothing has changed under this current system that we have. And I refer back to the statistics. And so then what I say to people, particularly post Mike Brown, there's a post Mike Brown Ferguson philosophy out here, where St. Louis black community is becoming a lot more politically savvy, particularly among young activists. And what I've tried to do is use those young activists to communicate that message. And I think that we've gained a lot of ground in that way. And John, and I've just been very simple. I hate to use this phrase, but I tell them that nothing has changed. In the current system that we have, absolutely nothing has changed for the black community. This is an opportunity to at least move towards change. And people have been kind of receptive to that.
Got it. Aaron or Ben, do you guys have additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, in St. Louis, I mean, people really get it. You know, the voters who we talk to have experienced this problem themselves with struggling with how to vote in a broken system where they have to think strategically about, well, who's raised the most money, who's actually my favorite. Whereas in this case, with approval voting, you can always vote for your honest favorite. It never hurts, and people can express themselves honestly at the polls. So I think they get it, and people are really familiar with the concept of a runoff election. And so regardless of where people came out of the last elections in terms of thinking what would have solved it, whether it's a runoff, whether it's nonpartisan elections, whether it's anti-vote splitting like approval voting accomplishes, or some people are more familiar with ranked choice voting. We were able to incorporate all of these solutions into one policy that we think works really well, and voters overall are responding to it. Occasionally, while I was gathering signatures, you get one person being like, no, I want to vote the regular way. But those people were definitely in the minority, just with status quo bias.
Got it. Great. All right. I have a question from Donna Limper of Illinois. It's about the decision to go with approval voting as opposed to ranked choice voting. So go ahead, Donna, ask your question.
I know ranked choice voting, you hear a lot more about that than you do about approval voting. The state of Maine passed it, New York City passed it. In Illinois, there is some momentum for ranked choice voting. So I was just really curious why St. Louis chose approval voting. Did you look at ranked choice voting? What did you feel the advantages were for your community to choose approval voting over ranked choice voting?
Yeah, well, there were a few reasons. So this was originally a campaign for ranked choice voting that was launched in early 2018. It didn't gain a ton of steam, and we later found out that St. Louis's election machines are actually not compatible with ranked choice voting. So that was a major barrier. And then we learned about approval voting from a podcast that Aaron at the Center for Election Science did. And it pointed out some really strong advantages from approval voting if you look at past runoff elections, whether instant runoff or traditional runoff elections, where approval voting might have led to a more democratic outcome with a lowercase d. So we really liked what we learned about approval voting, and the fact that it didn't cost a dime for our city versus paying millions of dollars to upgrade to ranked choice voting compatible machines was really significant. Tyler, who's our committee chair, had been to ranked choice voting national conferences, and he was going that direction because it had the most of the momentum. But there were some issues across the country where, at least according to Tyler, where and activists were at this conference talking about this problem where they would pass a law to put into place ranked choice voting, but the money wasn't in place and the implementation wasn't in place to make it happen. And with the situation with St. Louis City's budget and the politics, we just didn't think that it was going to be feasible to actually get it done. So both for practical and for democratic reasons in terms of looking at the outcomes and how approval voting is particularly well suited when you have at least 3 viable candidates running. That it all made a huge difference, and it made all the sense in the world to use approval voting.
Can I just ask a follow-up?
Yeah.
The election security apparatus cheaper for approval? Did you look at that part of your cost too, like to do audits and make sure that there's no fraud?
Great question. Yeah, if we were to try to force ranked choice voting into our current system with the machines that we have, it would involve a lot of complex things to do, which introduce more potential for error in terms of scanning PDFs and translating those results. And so there would be more potential security concerns, I guess, if we had gone that direction, since our machines are not up to date. When it comes to, a lot of Missouri has machines that are compatible. We didn't get to the point, it didn't make sense for us in St. Louis City to evaluate if we had the upgraded machines, would it make more sense to go one way or another from a security perspective? So no, we didn't look into that.
John, can I add to that?
Yeah,
Just-
yeah.
I think from a voter education standpoint, this was best in St. Louis. When I said that St. Louis is a northern city that faces south, the political culture in St. Louis seems to me it's very political machine oriented.
Right.
And if you're going to sell this, and I'll say this to the northern part of the city, you've got to come up with the simplest voter education campaign that you can, because we haven't had a lot of voter education campaigns, particularly on the north side of town. And so this is an easier sell for me in the African-American community than it would have been if you had have gone with ranked choice voting. It's just too much to try to unpack. This made sense in St. Louis.
The simplicity was a huge thing. Some people, I give voters more credit. I think people could handle either one, but there were a lot of people we heard from who said, yeah, I like the simplicity of approval voting.
Got it.
I'm more pragmatic.
All right. Before I ask, throw another question here, I actually want to ask a question of one of our participants, Reverend Gregory Livingston, who is a longtime civil rights leader from Chicago, recently transplanted, moved to New York City. He recently endorsed the St. Louis Approves campaign and is running a video throughout St. Louis. Greg, I wanted just to ask you, why'd you endorse St. Louis? What about it excites you?
It's about, this is a great conference call, and thank you, John and Reverend Gray. Thank you and everybody else on the call. I grew up in Chicago. Chicago and St. Louis are next door neighbors. Grew up with the Cubs, Cardinals rivalry,
Right.
and Gray can remember Lou Brock was on the Cubs, and the Cubs traded Lou Brock to the Cardinals, and oh man, that was some big stuff right there. And the old St. Louis Cardinals and Chicago Bears. So all this is real. We were connected, and it was nothing to hop in the car and just to drive to St. Louis, and St. Louis to drive to Chicago. But I understand so much of St. Louis being like Chicago with the whole machine politics piece. And in terms of folk like my parents who were migrated to the north for work, from Arkansas and everything. Same thing in St. Louis for a lot of Black families that came there for work, for better lives, better quality of life. And, and part of doing that, especially during those times, is that those families became dependent upon the politicians for providing certain services. That's the thing about machine politics. I can get you a vote for a pork chop sandwich and a Budweiser. And so the other brother was speaking. I didn't get to hear everything about the approval voting, but there are some intricacies and cultural pieces to voting in the Black community that have been rooted in terms of a survival mentality. And and I understand those coping mechanisms. Let me say it like this real quick, if I can. I come from an old family. My grandfather was born in 1883, and so I was 25 years old before I would put my hands, and I'm born in Chicago. I'm born and raised, here. I was 25 years old before I would put my hands in my pockets in a store. Because when I was growing up, my dad, my mom, my relatives, they always taught me, they're going to say you're stealing if you have your hands in your pocket. Wow. And so when I was 25, it finally hit me like, wait a minute. If the guy comes up to me and says, what are you doing? I can look back at him and say, what are you doing? Now, what I'm saying is, here I am, a guy who checked off all the boxes, went to school, did this and that, didn't have no grill, didn't have no hat cocked, ace deuce, my pants weren't dragging, nothing like that. But I still had my father's survival and coping mechanisms from the South that were taught to me. So oftentimes when you go into the Black community to try to create change, we have to respect what might be a negative now, but these survival mechanisms that have been implanted and are executed constantly within the culture because of America's DNA, as it were. And I think that St. Louis right now is prime. I was looking at the young brother, Rasheen Aldridge, with the whole Ferguson piece, and Mike Brown. I was down in St. Louis, I think about 2 or 3 years ago, and we were in Ferguson doing a couple of things. And, because that was just a keg of dynamite that exploded.
Right.
And you know what? It's not about any of the organizations doing the wrong things. No, it's not about that. The blame game isn't necessary. We're not trying to fix blame. We're trying to fix the problem, right? And because they've done so many great things, we just want to add to and enhance. And, you know, Reverend Darryl Gray has been down there laboring, you know, for many, many years. And the great thing I love is that he ain't tired yet. But say amen, Dr. Gray.
There you go.
Amen.
Thanks,
Amen.
Gray. Thank you
You
very
know,
much.
Yeah, and the thing that all of us who do this work, especially on the ground and having to deal with some of the most raw situations, as one might imagine, what tends to happen again is that I can get your vote for a Budweiser and a pork chop sandwich. Is that this whole system, which is part of who St. Louis is, just like Chicago, South Side and West Side, it's like that. And, you know, but they will come alive in an Obama moment.
Got it.
They will come alive, you know, on the other side of the spectrum in a Ferguson moment.
Right.
And the thing is, right now, with the country being in this incredible pandemic, I believe that this area is ripe, you see, as serving as a national beacon for what can be in terms of enfranchising or restoring the power of the enfranchisement, freeing the voter. You know, just because you have the right to vote doesn't mean you're free. You know, and so but in terms of this whole St. Louis approves and the like, you free the vote and you free the voter.
Right.
And so I
think they're gonna call you to write slogans for the campaign. So expect your
I agree. Thank you so much, Nathan, for your support and your leadership. It's really inspiring.
Thank you, brother. Yeah.
All right, I want to throw it to Kathy Stewart in New York, who has a question about what the opposition looks like. Kathy, take it away.
Thank you very much, John. It's so great to be on the phone with all of you. Congratulations for getting this on the ballot and giving the voters the opportunity to vote on this. My question, and just a quick prelude here, I've just spent the last several months in conjunction with Open Primaries. My organization, The People, has been working on the ground to defeat HB 1639, which was a bill that would have closed the primaries and forced partisan voter registration. So I asked my question from the vantage point of having been speaking to Missourians all over the state and who really care about the structure of the primaries and really care about a system being fair to all voters. So I wanted to ask you guys what you're seeing. What are the opposition talking points, and how is the opposition, who is the opposition, and what is that looking like in this part of the campaign?
Well, for me, and let me tell you something that John didn't say. I'm the secretary of the Missouri Democratic Party. I'm one of 4 officers of the Missouri Democratic Party. But I'm also the chair of the Progressive Caucus for the Missouri Democratic Party, which is why I believe this is important. My biggest pushback has come from Democratic Party leaders.
Really?
Yeah. As a matter of fact, one of the aldermen, and I'm sure Ben can speak to it, Alderman Joe Vaccaro came out very strongly against this, saying in the media that this would destroy the Democratic Party in St. Louis. My response to the alderman is that I'm more concerned about people than parties. And so I'm finding that out. I don't think, at least for me, I haven't gotten the big pushback yet from the Democratic Party machine, because the mayor has basically said, you know, she is neutral. She'll yield to what the voters say. But there's some undercurrent being discussed now, and I think Joe Vaccaro basically in his public statement said we're going to get some pushback from the party because the party has basically controlled everything through its Democratic Party Central Committee, and so I suspect that that's where we're going to get the most pushback.
Yeah, and I think part of it too is that people in St. Louis. I think what Reverend Gray said is exactly right in terms of the kind of pushback that we are getting from a couple corners. Of course, it's not universal. We have many officers of the St. Louis Democratic Party who, as you can see on our website, are public endorsers of the campaign. But I think some of those are more people who might be more knowledgeable about voting system reform, because we tell people, look, in all these other nonpartisan cities around the country, are you going to say the Democratic Party is not thriving in all these major cities around the country? And I think people don't realize that just because elections are not partisan doesn't mean that the party can't still be organizing and endorsing.
Right.
And in some cases, actually, the party is going to gain influence because now they can get involved and endorse slates of candidates in the primary, whereas before the party had to stay out of the primary. So this maybe even opens the door for more relevance for the Democratic Party. But, you know, it takes more education on our part now that we're moving into the campaign part and seeking more endorsements and influencer support. We'll be doing a lot of that work over the next few months, which is critical because if we don't do a good job of it, we could lose this campaign.
You know, just to follow up on that question, I was talking with David Cherry, who's on the call. He's a board member of Open Primaries and lives in Chicago. And he was describing to me how back in 2014 or 2015, when there was an effort to get rid of gerrymandering in Illinois, that the opposition, the number one talking point they had was that, oh, now that African Americans have gotten some people elected, now that they have Congress members and assembly members, now that they're rising up, now you want to change the rules. And how devastating that an attack was. And, you know, David, I shouldn't speak for you, David. Maybe you could give a little more flavor to that. But let me turn it over to David. I don't want to speak to David.
Thank you, John. First of all, I just want to say special greetings to our former Chicagoan, Reverend Livingston, and current Chicagoan, Aaron Hamlin. And just want to also commend Reverend Gray and Benjamin Singer for the work that you're doing. But yeah, John, I mean, to me, that's one of the things I find particularly offensive, that, you know, that there's always these efforts to try to get the Black community to oppose all kinds of political reform. And, you know, and it just flies in the face of why the Black community has been in the forefront of the fight for social justice and democracy in this country, whether it was fighting together with white people and other people to get the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments in the 1860s, or the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s and the 1960s. That was, all those fights were fights for more democracy. And so I'm pleased that what's happening in St. Louis is you have people like Reverend Gray and other people in the Black community who have joined with white people in St. Louis and other races to really fight for democracy in St. Louis. Because for me, and I know, you know, again, I've known Reverend Livingston for a while, but and Jesse Fields and many people who are in the Black community, this our fight has always been about how to change the conditions on the streets in our communities. That these are literally life and death issues. Like, the movement was never about simply electing, you know, people for any political party. The party was not the goal of the movement. It was always about addressing the fact that people are literally dying because of bad politics. And it's easy to get seduced into, well, the bad politics are caused by bad people, so let's elect some good people and kick the bad people out. But it doesn't do any good to elect good people to a dysfunctional system. That's why I'm so proud of the efforts that that the Reverend Gray and Benjamin Singer and more people are doing, because we have to change the dysfunctional politics before we can address the serious issues that are costing the lives of so many people. Yeah. So that's why I'm proud to be an endorser of St. Louis Approves.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
I want to throw it to Doug Goodman in Nevada, who is a fierce advocate for changing politics. Doug, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, John. Thank you for having this. I see a lot of familiar names up here.
Doug, just speak up a little bit. You're a little quiet.
Oh, okay. The big argument that I always hear when comparing ranked choice voting to approval voting is ranked choice voting allows the voter to express their choices in order of preference, where approval voting does not. And so I'm just curious how, Aaron or Benjamin, how you address this argument. And in fact, because really, Ted and Aaron and I have had several social media exchanges, really looking forward to how Fargo comes out, because this is the first implementation of approval voting. So I'm just curious how you would respond to the difference there.
We've heard some of that in St. Louis, and I'll turn it over to Aaron to address bigger stuff. But from even like the ranked choice voting advocates I've talked to, when we tell them how we structure this with the approval voting primary and the top two runoff, it kind of satisfies that ability, because in the runoff, you ultimately do have an ability to pick your favorite and rank between the top two candidates who are supported by the people. So we think that we were able to kind of get the best of both worlds into one policy here.
Mm-hmm.
So I tend to field some of the more technical questions. So with ranked choice voting and approval voting, like on the surface, it feels like, well, like I'm ranking candidates, it feels like I'm providing more information. But one thing to consider, like there are a number of components here. One is the kind of practicality with the ballot design itself. So you have a candidate list of like 15 people, it can become just like the thought process of ranking 15 people can be really challenging. And one can look at that and say, well, you don't really need to rank all of them. And some places, because of the complex ballot design, they will only let you rank, say, like 3 or 5, or they will truncate the ballot. And so in doing that, you have to consider that that's information that you're not providing, even though like technically ranked choice voting lets you rank as many as you can. In practice, in some cases, you may find that you can't. And then that's information that the voting method isn't able to use if it's ever provided in the first place. Whereas with approval voting, it's very easy to go through even a very long ballot with a number of candidates and being able to go through all of those and providing that approval or disapproval for each candidate. The other component here that approval voting does really well, in addition of doing a great job selecting a solid winner, is that it also excellently captures the measure of support for each candidate running, which is something that ranked choice voting actually struggles with. If you look at, say, in its best positive light for a candidate right before they're knocked out or eliminated in the sequence of rounds, even in that best light of support, that can have a big discrepancy between their actual support. And we've done that with experimental designs by having a control measure and seeing how the voting method compares to that control measure. Approval voting does a really nice job of capturing that support, even for candidates who don't win. And that kind of measure of support is really necessary in an election where you have a city, where you have all kinds of different ideas. You really want to make sure that all those ideas are heard and that they get the traction that they deserve.
Got it. Thanks, Aaron. And also, Aaron, jump in on non-technical questions. Okay, you're not just the
Right.
the technical expert. You're leading this effort. So don't feel free to chime in on anything. I want to throw it to my colleague Jeremy Gruber, who has a question about Missouri, and then I want to bring in Jesse Fields to talk about the New York experience back from 2003 and a bunch of other issues. We've got about like 10 minutes left, so let's. I'll keep things moving. Jeremy.
Thanks, John. And I just want to say my incredible compliments to Ben Singer, who's been able to not only be on this panel, provide a back and forth in the comments section. And I could never do that. And my brain would never work that way. So thank you for that.
Yes, well done.
My question is really about the state of Missouri overall. We, as Kathy Stewart mentioned, we just defeated a bill that would have closed the primaries. Last year, voters approved the Clean Missouri Act, which gave independent redistricting and campaign finance transparency a boost. And now the legislature has put an initiative on the ballot to pull that back. And we also, of course, have the STL Approves campaign, Prop D. So there's just a lot going on in Missouri right now, good and bad. And it's become a real microcosm of the country's back and forth debate on reform. So my question is, what's going on in Missouri? What's in the water in Missouri? And also, why do you think the rest of the country hasn't paid as much attention as they should in Missouri? With aside from Center for Election Science, the people, ourselves, there hasn't been a lot of national groups working in Missouri. But to me, Missouri is ground zero for reform in this country, as far as I'm concerned. So I'd love to hear why you think so much is happening there.
I mean, the Democratic Party has, I think, we've had this discussion about ranked choice voting and open primary. Winston Apple, I don't know if you're familiar with him. Winston is a member of he's a representative of the DNC out of Missouri, and Winston really pushed ranked choice voting. The Democratic Party felt as a whole that, once again, that it was just too much, but supported the resolution for open primary, I would say about maybe 3 months ago, to my surprise. I think you hit the nail on the head, and it was one of the reasons that I stayed in St. Louis. I think that I think Missouri it reflects the rest of America. It is the heartland. I call St. Louis, for Black folk anyway, I call St. Louis the new Selma and Missouri the new Alabama. I know maybe I shouldn't, but that's just where my head is sometimes. But when you look at just this last legislative session, obviously all the discussion was around COVID-19 and how we respond, but we talked about, we've got a narrow expansion of absentee voting. But at the same time, we got the Secretary of State that's trying to strengthen voter ID and bills that legalize brass knuckles. So Missouri is still very conservative. St. Louis is just as conservative as Missouri. And it's really gonna take a lot to break through that small C and large C conservative mentality. So anything dealing with reform, be it in St. Louis or Jefferson City, is gonna be a hard sell. That's how Missouri rolls.
I will say I agree with what Reverend Gray is saying, and as a cross-partisan organization at Show Me Integrity that works with Republicans, Democrats, and Independents, and as someone who was part of the team at Clean Missouri who helped with that ballot initiative, including working with our Republican supporters, we did start this organization at Show Me Integrity with the idea that Missouri can be and will be a leader in more accountable democracy in America, and can help be a watershed state for the rest of the country, especially as a purplish reddish state. There's a lot of anger and frustration and energy here to fight for a better system, and we saw that with Clean Missouri, which won overwhelmingly, and
it got like 63% of the vote, didn't it?
Right.
Yes. And it won in every county in Missouri, and petitions were signed by residents from every county in Missouri. We have a very accessible ballot initiative process here at local and state levels with strong local control. And so we think Missouri, given the energy from across the political spectrum, the support of editorial boards across the state who are tired of a dysfunctional democracy, and the ballot initiative process we have here and the size of the state, and like you said, it is a microcosm. Missouri demographically, in many ways, urban, rural, suburban, for a long time was basically a perfect microcosm of the country. Now, over the last 10, 15 years, that's changed a little bit, but we still are there. And so we think Missouri is a great place for democracy advocates to invest and pioneer new best practices at local and state levels.
You saw this in, just to editorialize for a minute, you saw this in Missouri, in Michigan, and Florida in 2018, where ballot referendums for different reforms, redistricting reform, restoring felons' voting rights, clean ethics and transparency, passed with broad pluralities of Democrats, Republicans, and Independents. And I feel like that's kind of an interesting new trend in the country, that where things don't just break down on Democrat versus Republican anymore. and
Right.
probably is contributing to why the legislature is so freaked out, because so many Republicans voted in favor of that reform effort.
Mhm. Right.
I want to bring Dr. Jesse Fields from New York into the conversation. Jesse, you had a question about kind of community involvement. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, John. I just wanted to say what a pleasure it is to be part of this conversation and to have the opportunity to support St. Louis Approves, the initiative there. Thank you to all of you. Thank you, Reverend Gray, and to Ben and to Aaron. And it's really, I think, very important. And I love St. Louis, the new Selma. Yes, let's go with that, because you know I've been working as a doctor for many years in the community and as an advocate. We see in this pandemic that the chronic health conditions in communities of color have been more exposed.
Right.
And as a doctor in the community and as somebody fighting for opening the political process, it's so important to give the community more choices, more options, to be able to grow and increase political participation and do something about the marginalization of the Black community politically, because it is the African American community in this country, as David and others were saying, that has led the fight to expand voting and to expand voting rights in America. And so we have to continue that. And for me, I think that nonpartisan elections, opening the primaries, giving everybody, letting all voters vote, is the next arena to renew that fight for equal voting rights for all. It gives us the opportunity to do that, because one important thing, of course, is that nonpartisan elections allows independents to vote in every round of elections. It lets everybody vote. In New York, as John mentioned, to sort of share our experience, because in 2003 here in New York City, we did fight for an initiative for nonpartisan elections that was on the ballot in New York City. And it was defeated, largely I think it was defeated by the fierce opposition from the Democratic Party machine. And they sort of tarred and feathered the initiative as ill-intended and as meant to decrease the representation from communities of color, that it was terrible. There were a lot of lies told, and in fact, nonpartisan elections has been shown to increase people of color in elected office. It's been shown to increase representation from communities of color. So I wanted to ask if you are starting to see similar kinds of attacks. I think they will be there if they haven't started already. And also, it sounds like there are dialogues about nonpartisan elections and the ability to improve conditions in communities of color, to impact on issues of health and education and other areas. I think those are very important dialogues to bring together folks who are fighting in different ways to change the process and to bring the voice of the community into the process.
I think Ben has done a tremendous job in St. Louis in bringing together this collective. Sometimes I come in the room and I look around, I say it's kind of an odd collective, but
Those are the best kind.
I know. I'm remembering the words of the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. He said, we build alliances based upon necessity and not necessarily desirability. So we look in the room and we realize that there are some differences. And when I'm talking about policy differences, political differences, but there's some commonality. Yes, we're getting the whisper pushback campaign, but it's just a whisper. And I think that those who get loud in trying to reject this will end up being shown for who they are. And that goes back to the whole silo, selfish politics.
Right.
If you support access to democracy, access to political opportunity, then open primary is the way to go. I think it's going to be hard for people to try to push back against this and not show themselves as selfish.
I also want to say, thank you, Reverend Gray, for the kind words. But, as seen in the polling and the research, no one feels stronger than the Black community about the lack of representation, the disenfranchisement, the vote splitting that we've seen in our elections. And you can see that not only, like I said, in the polling, but also in our endorsements. The elected officials who've been willing to get off the sidelines and take a stand for this have been largely from the African American community, because they have experienced most of the negative effects of this the most. I mean, you know, I'm just speaking as a white guy, but based on what I've seen in terms of who's been willing to step up and support this campaign and then was borne out in the polling, it makes a lot of sense anecdotally and statistically, and with who's actually stepping up on this. So yeah, it's great to be working with a great crew. I remember the first event we held, which Aaron had come into St. Louis for too, and Reverend Gray was there. It was this amazing energy in the room, you know, young and old, black and white, people from different parts of the political spectrum, even some people from St. Louis County who don't even live in the city, and just the amazing energy in the room, people excited for a system that represents them, where they feel that their vote matters, where they feel they have a voice. It's a really exciting movement.
That's great. And Ben, without knowing it, you actually answered the question from Steve that I was going to go to. Do you have support of elected officials in St. Louis? Maybe you could just add to that. Steve, I'm speaking for you, but like, who are some of the elected officials who've come on board?
Sure. So Reverend Gray himself is a former elected official, and like he said, an officer of the Democratic Party. Representative Rasheen Aldridge is on our steering committee and is one of the legal petitioners for this. And he was not a state representative when this campaign started. So it's been harder to hold our steering committee meetings now that he's a state rep. And as was mentioned earlier, he was on the Ferguson Commission. He was the youngest member of that. So he's obviously on board. Treasurer Tashara Jones was a citywide elected official. Numerous Democratic Party committee people are listed. I think I'm missing a few because I'm not looking at the list in front of me.
I know Marty Murray. Marty Murray is one of those committee people.
Yes.
Right.
And then we have a lot of voting rights advocates and leaders. And in terms of election officials, which I think is how I saw the...
Oh yeah, you're right. It's election officials. Yeah.
The question written. In case it was intended that way, you know, we did check with the directors of elections of St. Louis City before launching this campaign to ensure approval voting could be used for the on the machines. And so they haven't endorsed the campaign, but they told us it would be this would be much easier to administer.
And I know Reverend Livingston is very anxious and eager to go to St. Louis to get behind the pulpit and talk to voters about this. And if any of you just don't know Greg, the man is a genius behind the pulpit. So hopefully COVID gets lifted and that
I know.
Hopefully that will happen.
But John,
right.
Can I add this real quick?
Yeah. Go ahead.
You know, and the work that I've done, and God has blessed me to do it, you know, locally, nationally, around the world, and especially in dealing with oppressed peoples. One of the big things is the understanding that freedom and equality are not the same. And the reason I say that is that, you know, the freedom to vote, you know, but a gerrymandered vote is not a free vote. A partisan controlled vote is not a free vote. But freedom is the prerequisite to equality or the access to opportunities. It is that prerequisite to get there. So it's not enough to just be free and have the right to vote. Now, you know, you have to make your vote count. So you have individuals engineering, you know, ways to eviscerate your voting power. You know, that becomes a real problem. So, and oftentimes in educating the oppressed, many times when if I can speak like this, the oppressor will say, "You're free now, so what do you want? You know, what's the problem?" But we have to keep moving forward. I can't help it. You know, Gray, somebody got to close here now. Come on, Doc.
You're a preacher. You're doing what preachers do. I'm not mad at you. I'm feeling you.
No.
And Ben said he was white. I didn't know Ben was white. I thought you were passing. Forgive me, y'all. I'm getting too crazy.
Oh no, Ben is good people.
Oh, he brother.
All right. Aaron, Ben, Reverend Gray, any final words before we go? We're going to sign off here in 1 minute. Any last words?
I think that everybody has said it all eyes are on the Midwest. All eyes are on Missouri. All eyes have been on St. Louis since Michael Brown. And in the church, we ask this question. It's a question that's asked in the Protestant church. Can any good thing come out of Nazareth? People are asking this question. Can any good thing come out of St. Louis? This is something good that can come out of St. Louis.
Yes.
Got it. Aaron?
So I'm really excited about all the enthusiasm that I'm seeing in this virtual room for this campaign, and really excited to see, as was pointed out several times, it's the mere fact that you have a winner from an election doesn't mean that you've gone through the democratic process. You actually need a voting method that empowers you to get people that actually represent you. And so very excited to see this campaign. But this campaign also requires resources. So if you're moved, as many of us are, you can go to STL Approves. They have a nice donate page right there. You can also go to electionscience.org. They have a nice donate page right there as well. So I encourage you to support our campaigns and join us. So very excited.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks,
Yeah.
Aaron.
I will say this campaign wouldn't have been possible without the early investment from the Center for Election Science and all of its supporters. So huge thank you there, and thank you to Open Primaries for helping with the profile of this campaign nationally, and for your support and everything that you're doing to get the word out about this campaign. It means a lot. We, like I said, our polling is great. We're polling in the 70s. We're polling in near 80% with African Americans and near 70% with white voters. But if we don't do our job on the voter education, and we don't organize a strong campaign and talk to every influencer and have the resources to go out and talk to every influencer in St. Louis to prevent an opposition campaign from forming, we could lose this election, and it could be a big step back for all of these movements. So we do hope that people will support us, whether that's through money, or if you want to sign up to volunteer, we'll do some virtual phone banking down the line. So if you just want to stay up to date, definitely sign up at stlapproves.org. And thank you again. Thank you to Reverend Gray for your leadership here in St. Louis and in Missouri. Thank you to Open Primaries and Center for Election Science. Thank you to Dr. Fields. Thank you to Mr. Cherry. Thank you, Reverend Livingston, and Kathy Stewart. It's been a while since we've been on a phone call together, but good to see you. I'm sure when it comes to the Clean Missouri campaign, we'll be in touch as well. So I apologize if there's anyone else on this call who I missed. Oh, Eric Bronner, one of our board members who did the video for Open Primaries about why it's a major enfranchisement issue for military veterans as well. Thank you, Eric, for all you've done for this campaign too. And thank you to everyone, and onward, together, we can do this.
Great, thanks guys. Just a final word before we sign off. Next week, we're going to be talking with the Florida All Voters Vote team, so make sure to sign up for that Zoom call. Later in June, we're going to be talking with Catherine Gale, who has a new book out. She's the author of the explosive Harvard report about the political industry and the duopoly, and I'm really looking forward to talking with her sometime in June. We don't have a date set yet. So thank you, everybody. It's been a very quick hour, and we'll see you soon. Have a good day.
Thank you. Everybody be safe. Everybody be safe.